Hey there, Nick Gunitakis here. In this video, let's go over configuring Gunicorn with Flask, and let's do it in such a way that we can reuse the same Gunicorn config file in both development and production, but still have the flexibility to change a couple of values around. So just a heads up, we're going to be taking a look at the open source version of my Build a SaaS App with Flask course. So if you wanted to follow along, I'll leave a link to this in the description. If you just want to sit back and watch, that's no problem. But that's the application that we're going to take a look at. And let's begin by taking a look at the Docker file. And at the very bottom of this file is where we run the Gunicorn command. So all of the things that we're going to go over here will work just fine if you're not using Docker, but I happen to be using Docker, so that's why it's here. So this is pretty standard stuff if you're a Flask developer, right? We're just running the Gunicorn web server, and basically over here is how we launch our create app function. But in the middle here is how we can define a config file to load through Gunicorn. So it expects us to pass in a Python module. So let me go ahead and take a look here at the sidebar, and you can see here that the module is located in the config folder, and then it's going to expect us to have a file named Gunicorn. So if we take a look here in the sidebar, there's the config folder, and there is the gunicorn.py file. Now, it doesn't really matter what you name this directory or file. If you wanted to change this to something else, then it would work just fine. Just make sure that the path matches up to what you have here. So now let's take a look here at that Gunicorn config file. So this file is actually pretty basic. We're not configuring too many things. And in my opinion, this is why Gunicorn is so awesome. Like, you really don't have to configure too much. And most of the defaults out of the box are great. So that's why I don't have like a million different variables here. But the general pattern that we're going to pay attention to in this video is all of these lines here where I do a getEnv from the environment. Basically, we're reading in environment variables. So in the case of something like configuring the bind address, I want to bind that to 0000 port 8000 because I want to be able to access something like localhost port 8000 in my browser in development. And the 0000 allows me to connect from any type of device. Now, if you're not using Docker, typically you might bind this to something like localhost port 8000, but all of that's starting to get beyond the scope of this video. But if you take a look here, I am using the getEnv in a couple of spots. For example, Gunicorn has a reload option where in development you totally want to have reload enabled because that allows you to modify a Python file, and then it's going to reload all of your modules and classes, and you'll be able to get the code changed just by reloading your browser without having to stop Gunicorn and start it again. But that comes at a cost, right? It's not too efficient to do that. So in production, you really don't want reload mode enabled. So you can see here that I tried to read this one environment variable called web reload, and if it's not defined, then it defaults to false. Because my thought process here is I want all of these environment variables to default to something that is good for production. And then in development, I can actually go ahead and override these to be a little bit different. For example, I have this env example file here. And if I do a search for web reload, it is defined in my env file. This env file is very heavily commented, so feel free to read that on your own. But you can see here that for web reload, then it is set to true. And there's some shenanigans going on here, right? Just to convert the string representation into a valid Python Boolean, because this reload setting, it expects us to pass in a true or false Boolean. So in development mode, what I actually do is, and then this is part of the README file in the repo, is we basically copy over this env example file to a .env file, and then our Docker Compose file actually reads that env file in. And I guess I can show that really fast over here. If I do search for env, it's down here for the web container over here. We can see that we're loading in this env file, and that actually makes that environment file available to the Docker container. So if you're actually not using Docker, then you'll need to use some other mechanism for loading in a .env file. I think there's like a python.env library that I've used like, 5 years ago or something before I started using Docker. So that is one way to make a file of environment variables accessible to your Flask application. But in this case, you can see, since I do have web reload enabled over here, then this is going to just read it completely. This will modify it to be a true Boolean, and then boom, in development mode, it is all good to go. Whereas in production, then I just would not set web reload to true in the env file, because this env file is not commit to version control. This is meant for just development, because there would be very, secret things in here like email passwords and Stripe keys and all sorts of things like that. So on my production server, what I do is I create a different env file that has all the secret values that are totally separate from development or other environments. And I happen to use Ansible to set all that up. Maybe I'll do some more future videos about Ansible. Let me know if you'd like to see that in the comments below. But I don't want to get too deep into what Ansible is in this video. But if you take a look here at some other variables, we have things like workers. And Gunicorn workers is basically a way to deal with concurrent requests, right? In development, it's a really good idea just to deal with one thread and one worker, because when it comes to debugging and working with your code base, you wouldn't have to want to reload your web browser 3 times because you have 3 different Gunicorn workers running in development. So it's a really good idea to set that to 1. So if I actually scroll around here in this env example file, you'll see that for the web concurrency, it actually defaults to the number of CPUs in the box times 2. So, if you have a virtual or a VPS server that has 2 CPU cores, then you'll end up with a value of 4 here, because it's going to be okay, I have 2 CPU cores times 2 is equal 4. And this is actually the expected or a reasonable default value based on Gunicorn's documentation. Of course, you'll need to profile your application to really determine what CPU count you should use, but you really can't go wrong with CPU count times 2, to get this web concurrency. And the reason why I named this web concurrency, by the way, is I believe Heroku also uses this exact variable name. So I try to make all of my configurations compatible with Heroku, even if I'm not using Heroku myself, because it's an easy win. And web concurrency kind of makes sense for what workers does. But you can see here in development, just like the reload one, I override this default value and I just set it to 1, because in development mode, I want 1 worker. I don't want 4 of them, or however many CPU cores my box has. And that's basically the general pattern when it comes to this. So I think this is a really, really nice way to configure Gunicorn, because it means you don't really have very much duplication at all, right? You can have this single Gunicorn config file, and it can totally work in development and production. And then you just situationally tweak a couple of things that you want to override. And in production, if you set same defaults for production, you really don't even need to create that many environment variables in production. So that is how I manage all of my configuration when it comes to Gunicorn. If you're using it in Django instead of Flask, the same pattern would work as well. So with that said, thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. Or if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer it. With that said, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.